It's noon in Santiago in Chile, and it's 5 p.m. in Oxford, where our guest is today. I want to introduce Colin Mayer. We're delighted that you could join us for this webinar. Colin is professor at the Saïd Business School at Oxford University, an expert on all aspects of corporate finance, governance, the regulations of financial institutions, and the role of corporations in modern society, and author of this book, Prosperity, Better Business Makes Greater Good, published 2018. And it's a great book. I highly recommend it, and available in Amazon. So thank you, Colin, and for agreeing to speak with us. And I want to introduce our co-host for this event, Bernardo Larraín. He's the president of the Chilean Federation of Industries. Bernardo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen, for the invitation. Thank you, Colin, for your time. It's an honor to be able to talk to you. We've been in a process, our organization that represents more than 4,000 companies of different sectors of the economy, of thinking about purpose, and that process was triggered by reading your book and by reading also the update of the declaration of the Business Roundtable. So we brought that debate into Chile, so it's very interesting for us to be able to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. Well, maybe I should start with a question that comes out from reading the book, probably the first one. You and many others have written about how the Milton Friedman mantra of shareholder primacy is no longer valid, even though many in corporate America and corporate Chile still continue to believe in it. We're very much looking into your insights on this matter. So a couple of related questions. Why was Milton Friedman wrong? Was he totally wrong? What is the purpose of a corporation? And maybe if you can give us a couple of examples of companies that do well by doing good.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much indeed for welcoming me. It's a great pleasure to be doing this. I'm going to be talking to you about one of the most important institutions in our lives, because business clothes, feeds, and houses us, employs us, and invests our savings. It's the source of economic growth and prosperity around the world. But at the same time, it's been a cause of growing environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. And in particular, about a month ago, Edelman, the company that produces their trust barometer, reported that in response to this current pandemic, less than 40% of people around the world believe that business is doing a good job in terms of putting people before profits, looking after their employees adequately, or supporting their suppliers through extending them credit and delaying the demands for payment. Now that's a very important issue, because underpinning what's going on around the world is that business in many cases is being bailed out by governments that are providing loans, grants, tax exemptions on the basis of a lot of public support for ensuring the continuity of business. But when in the financial crisis, there was the similar public support initially for the bailing out of the banks, that rapidly turned to considerable disquiet and derision about the failure of the banking system to respond sufficiently rapidly in terms of recognition of its social license to operate. It is critically important that business does not make the same mistake this time round, because the consequences for doing that will be much more serious now than they were 10 years ago. Now, underpinning this notion of mistrust in business is the notion of what the purpose of business is. And that notion of purpose goes back to what Milton Friedman said in 1962 and then again in 1970, that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that's been the basis of business practice, policy, leadership, and education ever since. But it wasn't always the case. Indeed, business was originally established under Roman law some 2,000 years ago with a very public purpose of collecting taxes, minting coins, looking after public buildings. And for nearly all of its 2,000-year history, it has combined the notion of a public purpose alongside its commercial activities. It's basically, over the last 60 years, that this notion that there is only one purpose of business, to make money, has arisen. And that has been the underpinning of that growing environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. But things are changing rapidly. We've had, at the beginning of 2019, Larry Fink, the CEO and president of BlackRock, the largest investment management business in the world, saying that every business needs to have a purpose, not a strapline or a marketing campaign, but a statement of its fundamental reason for being. And that was followed in August of last year by the Business Roundtable statement, jettisoning the notion of shareholder primacy in favor of a statement that the purpose of business was to deliver value to customers, invest in its employees, support its societies and its suppliers, and deliver long-term value to its shareholders. And the focus of the World Economic Forum in Davos was around the notion of the purpose of business in the fourth industrial revolution. Now, there was an immense head of steam building up before the pandemic broke out. But since then, the relevance of purpose to business has become even greater. And the reason for that is that purpose provides a way of allowing companies to steer themselves through this crisis and out of it. First of all, it provides a basis on which business can determine the difficult trade-offs it has to make between, for example, supporting its employees or cutting costs and being able to supply its customers, many of them in need, of cheaper products and services. In terms of making trade-offs behind supplying social and public goods and services and continuing to maintain their dividend payments, which are in many cases crucial for their investors, for example, their pensioners. But even more significantly than that, the purpose of a business provides a clear indication as to how business should be rebuilding itself out of the crisis, where it should be putting its priorities. Because our preferences and priorities as customers, employees, societies are changing as a consequence of the crisis. And that gives rise to considerable opportunities for business, as well as threats and risks. And what a purpose does is to indicate where companies can invest to produce real value propositions for their investors, as well as their societies and customers. Now, the notion of purpose that underpins this is that it is not just about making profits. The purpose of a business is to produce solutions to problems, to help us to solve our problems as customers, employees, societies, and the natural world. And to do so in a way that is profitable. This is not about philanthropy. This is about hard-nosed business. And the way then in which business can produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. And it should not profit from producing problems for people or planet. That notion of purpose is not woolly, it's precise. It's about what problems companies are solving, for whom, how they're solving those problems, and why that company is particularly well suited to solving those problems. And that notion of solving problems and putting that as the priority of a business is a way in which it creates a greater sense of trust amongst its constituents, its customers, and its employees in a form that delivers benefits for the company as well as the rest of society. It is not about corporate social responsibility. It's not about doing something on the side that is good while remaining doing exactly the normal things that have been done in the past as the core parts of the business. It is about the core functions of a business and aligning the strategy of a business with its purpose. Now, I want to illustrate this in relation to a particular example. And the example I'm going to take is of a Danish pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk, which produces insulin. Insulin is used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is in particular found in low and middle income countries around the world, about 85% of it in those parts of the world. Novo Nordisk, until about 6 or so years ago, described its purpose as being to produce insulin. It was simply descriptive of what it does. But a purpose is not just a mission statement of what a company does. And it thought further then about its notion of purpose and recognized that actually a truer description of it was its purpose was to help people treat type 2 diabetes. So it started working with hospitals, doctors, universities around the world to identify the best ways of treating type 2 diabetes. And then it realized, well, actually, its purpose was even a bit more than that. It was to help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes at all. So it, in addition, started working with governments, local authorities, with health workers around the world to identify the changes in lifestyles which would help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes. Now you might say, well, that's all very well, all very noble, but didn't it undermine the fundamental business model of Novo Nordisk? And the answer is no. It did exactly the opposite. Its business has boomed on the back of it. Why? Because in the process of building those relations with governments, with universities, with medical professionals, it built up relationships of trust. And it therefore became the preferred supplier of advice, of medical products for a variety of different parties around the world. And that notion of trust as being a critical determinant of the success of business is a very important factor to bear in mind. What this brings out is 2 points. First of all, the importance of the clarity of what a purpose is, and secondly, an understanding that if a company effectively embeds a purpose in its business, then it creates a more valuable business because of the trust that it thereby engenders in its customers, more loyal customers, in its employees, more engaged employees, in its suppliers, more reliable suppliers, and more supportive societies and shareholders. And to achieve that, what business needs to recognize is that, first of all, it needs to have the leadership and the governance that instills the notion of purpose throughout the business. It's the role of the executive and the board to identify a company purpose, and to ensure that it is implemented throughout the organization from the board down to the shop floor. But it also requires the support of the owners of the business, its shareholders, who need to provide the backing for the board to implement those purposes. So the role of owners in terms of initiating and promoting a corporate purpose is critical to its successful enactment in the organization. A third element that's critically important is to measure the performance of companies, not just in terms of their financial returns, but the extent to which they are really fulfilling their purpose and not profiting from producing problems in the process of doing that. And there's been a whole industry that's developed around how one should measure performance beyond just financial performance. And the final factor that's critically important is to recognize the role that government and investors play. I've mentioned the fact that government has played a very important role in terms of helping to bail out businesses around the world. And it's important to recognize that that is on the basis of a reciprocal relationship by which that support is being provided on the presumption that business will respond by supporting its stakeholders and supporting the rebuilding of business and economies around the world. And investors have a key role to play, because alongside the loans and the grants that come from business, they have to be able to raise equity capital, risk-bearing capital. And so the institutional investors need to provide the support that companies need in terms of cutting dividends where they have to cut their dividends and raising new equity finance. Those notions of leadership, governance, ownership, measurement, finance, and partnering effectively with government are key to the development of business in the years to come. And if that happens, and companies adopt purpose as being core to their activities, then we will be able to move forward not only out of this crisis, but really to be able to take advantage of the tremendous technological opportunities that are currently in process to bring prosperity to the many, not just to the few, for the future as well as the present.
Thank you, Colin. Let me follow up on that. I couldn't agree more of the importance of purpose as the main builder of trust, as a glue that basically gets engaged the different stakeholders that are essential for the success of the company. But just before killing Friedman's mantra, maybe I would like to address some of its failures and maybe some of the omissions. I would say that you mentioned the phrase of one and only. I think that's one mistake, basically. The second mistake is that he's talking about profit, and I would rather talk about value. And the third is an omission, which is basically doesn't mention the horizon of time in which business decisions are taken. So my question is it not better to kill short-termism instead of Friedman's mantra? Because in the long term, I'm talking about your book, that describe the firms and the corporations as a place where a lot of sources of capital get together, meaning human capital, natural capital, financial capital, and also entrepreneurship capital. All of them are essential for the success of the company. And I would say that in the long term, if you really put value and long term in Friedman's statement, you end up aligning the interest of society at large, the interest of stakeholders, and the interest of shareholders. So my point is that, is it not short-termism that has to be killed?
Well, let me answer that by actually referring back to what I think were exactly the right points you were making in terms of the omission in Friedman's statement. When you said one and only purpose of business, I think you're absolutely right that if you'd said one purpose of business is to make profits, I think everyone would be in agreement with that. And the way in which I defined a purpose was in saying that it should be a profitable solution to the problems of people and planet. So investors and shareholders are a critical component to the success of business, and the notion of it delivering a profit is absolutely right. It's the notion that it's only there to deliver a profit. And also your point about value rather than profit, I think is absolutely correct. But this then comes on to the notion as to whether or not it is simply a matter of the horizon or whether it's more than just the horizon. Because I would say it's not just a matter of value as against profit, but values as against profit. Namely, that the value of the business, the financial value of the business, is a key factor. But a business has to recognize the values that underpin it and which it needs to support in terms of the support that it's providing to societies, to helping to address environmental issues, and that those are associated with benefits in terms of financial returns, but it has to recognize also the intrinsic importance of those values. And that you're right in saying that short-termism is a major problem and a major impediment to business being able to do that. And that in the long run, the focus on those values beyond just financial benefit do in general deliver benefits to companies. But one also has to recognize that there is an importance in terms of being able to deliver short-term benefits as well. Just take the current pandemic crisis. Okay? The response, the short-term response of business to the crisis is critically important. And we read in the press all the time now how some companies are really rallying to this, recognizing the role that they should be performing and responding appropriately, and others are not. And that is going to affect people's perceptions of those businesses going forward. Okay? So the immediate and relatively short term can be a very important consideration, as well as what is the long-term implication of what business is doing, and the recognition that they have to support parties beyond just their shareholders in the relatively short term is an important consideration to put alongside the horizon.
Thank you, Colin. If you mentioned the Business Roundtable Manifesto from last August, many critics saw it as a cynical move or a defensive, preemptive strike to avoid regulation at a time in which Bernie Sanders was leading the polls and at which Senator Elizabeth Warren was a presidential candidate as well, and had proposed this Accountable Capitalism Act, which besides proposing that law must enforce interests of all stakeholders, also proposed that 40% of the board should be elected by workers. So how do you think these potential regulations weighted into the Business Roundtable decision? And then at the Q&A session, maybe I'll ask you why Lars Sorensen was sacked from his position as CEO of Nordisk.
Okay, so the short answer is unquestionably. The Business Roundtable reaction was significantly influenced by what were perceived to be growing political, regulatory risks if they didn't act. Now, it's important to recognize that that type of threat is precisely one of the reasons why, if business does not respond better in this crisis than they have done in past crises, the consequences for business are going to be much more serious this time round. So that notion that business responds to threats, doesn't just act in an altruistic fashion, has a lot of justification to it. But it's one of the reasons why this is such a serious issue for companies around the world, because the sorts of things that we're observing going on in terms of growing political disquiet, social unrest, etc., are not unrelated to the way in which business conducts its activities. And if it does not respond appropriately, then regulation, changes in law along the lines of what Elizabeth Warren was going to do, nationalization, which is what the British Labour Party was intending to do, those will be high in the agenda. So you're absolutely right in saying that there was a stick, but there's also a carrot. And that carrot comes from the fact that there is now, post-pandemic crisis, a growing recognition of the risks, not just from government, but the risks that come from external threats. One of the reasons why purpose was growing so rapidly in significance before the crisis was the growing recognition of the existential threat that we faced from climate change. Now that hasn't gone away. That is very much still on the agenda. And what we're going to recognize going forward is increasing frequency of crises and a growing recognition from business and the investors that unless business responds to those threats by diminishing the likelihood of those crises, it completely undermines our capitalist model. So it's not just the political regulatory threat that is prompting these changes. It is much more a growing recognition of the seriousness of the situation in which we find ourselves.
Thank you, Colin, and doing a double click on that debate around the Business Roundtable declaration. What I found interesting was the criticism that was done by the Economist news magazine. Basically, they thought that the criticism was twofold. First of all, they foresee a risk in developing a kind of unaccountable CEOs who are more interested in emphasizing with social causes that are embraced by employees and clients than in being accountable for the value they create. And that was one aspect of the Economist's criticism, because basically it's based on when you're accountable for all, says the Economist, you're accountable for none. So that's one risk. And the other one, the Economist argues that the stakeholders' capitalism could eventually weaken corporate dynamism, in the sense that, especially in times like this one, there will be a transformation of industries, and that transformation of industries will be harmful for some stakeholders. And precisely that's one of the distinguished contributions of the corporations, that basically they have to make the economy to become more innovative, more efficient, to those solutions that they have to solve. They have to be cost-efficient solutions. They have to be always evolving, and that dynamism doesn't come without pain. So sometimes there is pain to some stakeholders. So the Economist says this is the distinguished feature of the corporation that basically enables these transformation processes to be done in a cost-efficient way and allocating resources with dynamism. And it is going to be the case in this crisis. There will be firms that will probably go bust. There will be firms that will be transformed. There will be firms that were better prepared for the, let's say, the digitalization and automatization that is speeding up, and that requires this dynamism that the economists argue that could be weakened with shareholders. And he doesn't criticize the importance of purpose. On the contrary, he argues that purpose is not a matter which is the sole responsibility of CEOs, but it has to be built up in integration with shareholders with a long-term view. How do you view that criticism of the economist, and how is this stakeholder-focused paradigm adapt to the reality created by the COVID pandemic, where we will have to have some transformation and painful transformations?
Let me start off with your observation that accountability to everyone is accountability to no one. Because,
that's an observation by the economist, not myself.
Because the converse of that is to say accountability to one party means that all others don't count. And that is a large part of the issue and the problem that we're currently facing. That many people feel they don't count because the only thing that is being counted is in relation to one party in society, namely the owners and the investors. Now that comes on to your second point, that if you give a multiplicity of purposes to companies, it confuses things, it undermines the operation of markets, of the dynamic process of selecting out creative destruction and all of that. Well, let me just emphasize that it does exactly the opposite. It imposes an even more rigorous market process than we have at present. And you only have to think about what's going on at present to realize that that's the case. Because what it does is it says that the market process, in terms of the competition it elicits, should be competition that creates benefits. We view markets and competition as markets as delivering desirable social welfare outcomes. And when we're at university and learning economics, we're taught all about how the competitive markets do that. They don't do that if companies can profit at the expense of other parties. That is precisely the problem. That the incentives that are given to companies are inappropriate unless one appropriately accounts for what are the true costs that companies are imposing on society and what are the true benefits that they are delivering. Without that, the competitive process actually can support great inefficiency. And what this agenda is doing is to say, let's get those measures right. Let's get a run to the top in terms of the performance of companies, in terms of delivering social benefit, not as we've been seeing so much of, runs to the bottom in terms of the way in which competition in markets is delivering outcomes for society and customers and employees and investors.
Thank you.
Colin, culture and tone from the top are key in inspiring and in permeating purpose to the whole corporation. I want to talk about one example. The CEO of Boeing signed the Roundtable Manifesto. At that time, he was Dennis Muhlenberg. And however, their purpose, let me read you, is connect, protect, explore, and inspire the world through aerospace innovation. I'm going to stick to the word protect. Regarding the MAX 737 scandal, after the investigations, we all found out the problems were known in the organizations, that leaders failed to address them, that safety procedures were bypassed, and that company misled regulators. So the tone from the top here did not align with purpose. How do you permit purpose to both culture and leadership?
Okay, well, thank you for the Boeing example, and one could have cited many examples. One could have
Right.
cited Enron as having one of the most impressive statements and ethical codes of any business. And what it illustrates is the fact that it's one thing to state a purpose, it's another to enact it.
Mm-hmm.
And what we are focused on is how does one really embed a purpose in a business? And I've given you some indications as to what the key elements to doing that are. We've developed a framework around which businesses can very effectively do that. It's what we term the SCORE framework, which stands for to simplify the notion of purpose so that it's a very clear, precise notion. Now that notion that purpose that you were describing in relation to Boeing is an indication of what I would describe as not being a purpose statement, because it is not saying, well, what problems exactly does Boeing see itself as solving? Okay? And it's certainly not solving problems if in the process of doing so, it hides known failures in terms of the safety of the machines that it's producing. That is what I'm terming profiting by producing problems for people on planet. Okay? The second part of the SCORE framework is to connect, to engage with all of the parties to the firm, within the firm and external to the firm. Well, what we know about the case of Boeing is it wasn't connected. It was highly disconnected, in part because of the separation between where production was taking place in Seattle and where its headquarters was in Chicago. And that the leadership was seriously disconnected with what was going on the shop floor of Boeing. The third element is ownership. And ownership is about a real commitment on the part of owners to promoting corporate purpose and ensuring that it's owned throughout the organization. Now, one thing we know about Boeing is that prior to its merger with McDonnell Douglas, it had a culture which was absolutely focused on safety. It put a lot of emphasis on supporting the engineers in the organization. But progressively after that merger, which essentially became an inverted merger, by which the culture shifted in the direction of McDonnell, its culture shifted towards financial engineering. And so there was no ownership within the organization. On the contrary, what was being told to people on the shop floor was, we are simply interested in you minimizing costs and maximizing returns. The fourth element is R for rewarding people, making sure that the purpose is reflected in the way in which people are incentivized in the organization, through their pay, through their promotion, etc. And that requires providing the measures against which the purpose can be evaluated and people can be rewarded. That increasingly became the opposite of the way in which Boeing was operating, placing more and more emphasis on financial return as being the sole determinant of the performance of people in the organization. And the final element is to exemplify, to build narratives around the purpose that really bring it to life and give it meaning within the organization. And that is a key role of leadership to ensure that those narratives are firmly understood within the organization. Again, the direction of travel of Boeing in that regard was precisely the opposite of a narrative around a purpose that was associated with safety, with delivering what customers needed and wanted.
Thank you, Colin. And we've been talking about the shareholders and ownership of companies and the different schemes of ownerships and types of shareholders. I think by reading your book, you value family businesses or businesses where there are owners which are not, let's say, an anonymous large number of shareholders. And just for you to know, most of the corporations in Chile are family controlled, and they also have, in combination with, let's say, an anchor shareholder, institutional investors.
Sure.
And I remember that we invited Dominic Barton of McKinsey a few years ago, just after the financial crisis in 2008. And he argued that this combination was pretty good, you know, for like purpose-driven organizations and for long-term view and for incorporating the different stakeholders at the core of the strategy of business. This combination of anchor shareholders with diluted shareholders. And he argued that part of the crisis in 2008 was the scheme of very diluted shareholdings in the US, you know. But the question I have is, well, if you can elaborate more on that, and also how a family-owned business that grows avoid becoming, let's say, a large bureaucracy, and let's say loses the founder's mentality, which many times that mentality is the one that basically keep purpose and keep culture strong in the company. Let's say, how do you keep founders' mentality in large corporations?
Okay, so let me start off by observing that Chile is by no means an exception in terms of the significance of family ownership in even its largest listed companies. That is true almost everywhere in the world, with one or two exceptions, one of which is my country, the UK, and a second exception to a lesser extent than in the UK is the US. Family ownership is more prevalent in the US than it is in the UK. Now, one of the reasons why family ownership is so prevalent is that it does have potentially significant benefits associated with it, in particular when it takes the form of parallel ownership between families and listing companies on stock markets. And the benefit that it confers is the long-term perspective that families frequently bring, that they regard their ownership of their companies as being an intergenerational proposition. And by having those significant blocks of shares that they own for long periods of time, many generations, they can exert a substantial degree of influence on companies for the benefit of those companies. They can, as it's sometimes said, be a real force for good. But one also has to recognize that they can be exactly the opposite. They can be a real force for bad. Okay, so what a block holding does is to confer potentially a lot of influence on control of companies, which can be exercised for good or evil. And we have plenty of examples of the latter as well as the former. I only have to mention the example of Purdue Pharmacy and the Sackler family to recognize how some family-owned companies have created many problems. In that case, in terms of the opioid pandemic that spread through, in particular the US, but in many parts of the world. Now, what this illustrates is that the way in which families exercise their potential influence on companies is critically important. And recognizing their role in defining a purpose that goes beyond just the financial returns that they earn from their companies is critically important. And that is precisely what the best run family firms are doing. They are helping their companies to establish a purpose that reflects the role that those companies can play in terms of producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. And because they hold for a long term, they can ensure that that is embedded as a long-term objective of the firm. Now, you raise the question of, well, what happens as family-owned firms move from one generation to the next? Because in general, when companies are established by a founder, they have a clear notion of what their purpose is. You need to have a clear notion of your purpose when you start off, because otherwise you're just not going to have a business model to develop. But that frequently gets lost as the company moves, first of all, to become listed on stock markets and then moves from one generation on to the other. Now, there's an increasing focus amongst next generations of family owners on purposes of business that go just beyond their financial returns. So many family businesses are finding that their children, their successors, are only willing to take on their businesses if they can shift it in the direction of being a more purposeful organization. But in some cases, it's recognized, well, that's not going to happen. And where it's the case that the nature of the succession to the company may not seem to be appropriate, then what do companies do? Well, one model that is observed, which has proven to be a very successful model in particular in Denmark and in Germany, is what is termed an industrial foundation, where instead of passing on their family businesses to their heirs, the founders or the next generations put those companies into a foundation. An industrial foundation in the sense that the foundation doesn't just give away money, it actually has a controlling shareholding in the companies in which it invests. And the advantage of that model is that it allows the principles and values associated with the founding of the company to be retained in the business as it moves forward. And what one observes about those industrial foundation-owned firms, in particular in Denmark, is that in terms of their financial performance, they perform at least as well as other types of companies. But they have one distinguishing feature, and that is that they survive for much longer. And that notion of survival is, I think, an important indicator of the success of a firm in being able to retain and implement its purpose.
Thank you, Colin. I'm going to pick up some questions from the chat here. Who determines the purpose? The CEO, the shareholders, other stakeholders? What happens when they start conflicting or competing with each other, the stakeholders? Another question here is the principles of purposeful business from the British Academia lists as number one, the need to change corporate law. Can you explain in which way the law needs to be changed and what can we expect from it?
Okay, thank you for those two very good questions. So first of all, in terms of who determines the purpose, the answer is that for the most part, it's regarded as being the role of the executive of a company, which then puts the notion of the purpose to the board for ratification by the board, so that it gets signed off by the board. That initially when a company is set up, it's clearly the role of the founder to define the purpose. And then for the reasons that I was just suggesting, where there's a block holder, a family or other type of block holder, then it may be the role of the family or the industrial foundation to ensure that that purpose is appropriately retained and enacted within the business. But having said it's the role of the executive and the board, then what is really important in terms of understanding how to promote purpose is that it should involve everyone in the organization. It should not be simply regarded as something that is defined from a small group at the top and imposed on everybody else. It's something that everyone has to buy into. There has to be a real sense of a purpose inspiring people, exciting people, making them feel that what they are doing in their organization is really worthwhile and meaningful, something they can connect to. And to do that, one should go through a process of consulting with people as to what they think about this notion of purpose that is emerging, how they think that it can be improved, how it can be given greater clarity so that everyone can connect with it. And that people need to understand how that broad purpose of business translates into what is going on within their particular divisions or departments or locations within the organization, so that their purpose is related to the broad purpose of the business. So the way in which you resolve that type of problem is through a process of consultation, engagement of people in terms of the formulation. And that is one of the most powerful things that a purpose can do. It can bring people together in terms of their contribution to the way in which it's determined as well as enacted. Now, let me come to your other question about law. In terms of corporate law, the way in which law is formulated around the world is basically in terms of the notion that the directors of a company have a duty to promote the success of the firm for the benefit of its shareholders. And in general, there's some notion that in so doing that, the directors of a company should have due regard to the interests of other parties, the stakeholders to the firm. So what it does is it talks in terms of the success of the firm, but where the notion of the success of the firm is predominantly associated with the interests of shareholders. Now, many people say, well, that's absolutely fine. It's permissive. It basically allows companies to do whatever they want to do. It doesn't stop them putting forward a purpose statement. It doesn't stop them placing emphasis on their stakeholders and supporting their stakeholders, which is absolutely true. But it also does not provide an element of protection of companies that are seeking to promote their purpose, in many cases involving a long period of time in terms of the implementation of that purpose. And that's where the law can play a very important role in terms of helping to embed purpose in business. In the United States, there has been a recent development in corporate law around the inclusion of what is termed a public benefit corporation. A public benefit corporation is something that establishes a purpose with a public benefit in addition to the role of the company in delivering commercial benefits to its shareholders. And if boards of directors fail to uphold that corporate purpose, then they can be subject to litigation from their shareholders, their owners. And what it has done over the last few years is to spread across now to some 35 or so states in the United States, including in Delaware. So companies increasingly have the option to adopt a public benefit corporation structure if they so wish. Now, that is a type of approach that I'm talking about. So it's not a revolutionary legal entity. It's one that has got a sound precedent and is already being widely applied. But at the moment, it's predominantly associated with relatively small companies in the United States. What I would suggest is that it's exactly at the opposite end of the spectrum in relation to the largest companies where it has the most significant role to play. For example, in relation to what are sometimes termed the commanding heights of an economy, the utilities, the banks, public service companies, public providers, infrastructure companies that are performing particularly important public functions. For them, the notion of a company having a clearly defined purpose, in addition to a financial objective, is critically important in aligning its objectives with those of its social license to operate.
Thank you, Colin. There are some questions about alignment between ownership and purpose that it's you've said it's very important, and also there are mentions about the ethical investment funds, as well as you mentioned as well big investment funds that have declared the importance of purpose for companies in which they invest. Let me add to that questions that I've captured from the chat. The fact that measuring sort of putting indicators to the social performance, environmental performance, and let's say trust building, it's a big challenge. And many times companies have already incorporated to the core of the strategy, you know, to the stakeholders and the social performance and environmental performance, but they lack of proper measures. And not only that, but still the conversation with those funds, it's lacks of those indicators. So at the end, you tend to move and to concentrate on things that are measured, and maybe you just talk about, let's say, social performance, environmental performance on a subjective way. And that obviously creates difficulties. And I think even though you can be very aware of the importance of incorporating at the core of the strategy, well, we've talked to date, the big challenge has been transforming those performances into indicators. So how do you think about that? And what would be some examples from institutional investors, from ethical funds that could give us some light on that respect?
Okay, so first of all, on the question about ownership and ethical funds, it's absolutely right that there is a growing movement amongst institutional investors to move towards what is often termed impact investing, where institutional investors are emphasizing factors beyond financial returns. And they're doing that in response to a growing interest on the part of their investors in investments in companies that deliver more than just a social return. And indeed, there's an argument that's emerging that says, well, actually, if you think about the fiduciary responsibilities of investors, institutional investors, it should be not simply to deliver financial value to their investors, but also to deliver broader benefits beyond that. In other words, that institutional investors should be promoting not simply the wealth of their investors, but their welfare. And why is that the case? Well, because investors are actually humans. They are interested in their survival, the existential threat that climate change poses to the world, to the health of their descendants. And therefore, they have a direct interest in precisely the sorts of factors that I've been talking about, in addition to the extent to which their investments are yielding financial returns to them. So that there's an argument that says that not only is there growing interest in institutional investments in impact investing, but that all institutional investors should be emphasizing the significance of these factors as being their fiduciary responsibility to promoting the well-being of their investors, not simply the wealth of their investors. Now, what that implies is, as you're suggesting, that to be able to do that, we need to have a mechanism by which investors, institutional investors, can determine the extent to which companies are delivering benefits that go beyond financial returns. We have now learned how to measure financial performance appropriately. But we didn't always know how to measure financial performance appropriately. Indeed, we're very much in the position that we were in shortly after before the stock market crash of 1929 and then the Great Depression, prior to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, setting out accounting rules in the early part of the 1930s. We're in exactly the same position, where there are a myriad of measures that are being put forward for evaluating performance beyond financial returns, where there's a considerable degree of confusion that's arisen because of a failure to provide any degree of data verification, verifiability of what companies are doing, or auditing of the accuracy of the information that's being provided. And what is now in the process of happening is an evaluation of the quality of different types of performance measures that are being put forward, with a view that there's going to be a growing focus on a relatively small number of measures of, for example, an ESG, environmental, social, and governance form, that are going to become potentially universal indicators that all companies are going to be expected to abide by or be measured by. Secondly, that there may be some that are specific to particular sectors, but not to others. And then there should be measures that are specific to particular companies. And alongside that, that we are going to see the equivalent of what happened in relation to the standardization that occurred after the SEC legislation in 1932 and 33, and that is standardization around accounting performance to incorporate precisely what I've been talking about, and in particular a notion of measuring profit, which recognizes that profit should not be measured in terms of including the damage profiting from producing problems for people and planet.
Thank you, Colin. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We have so many questions, including one that we discussed before we started, which is the CEOs in the US filling in the void left by politicians. But we have run out of time. I really appreciate you accepting to participate in this webinar that the Columbia Global Center and Sofofa put together. Again, I'm going to show the book, Prosperity. I hope you can come to Chile and sign it personally if there's any possibility of flying anytime soon. But the book is available on Amazon, and the recording will be posted in both the website at the Columbia Center and at Sofofa. Bernardo, thank you very much for co-hosting this event. And again, Colin, thank you. Stay safe. Be well.
Thank you very much to both of you for having invited me and for having hosted this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin and Karen, for the proposal to do this. It was an excellent conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I enjoyed it a great deal. Thank you.
Thanks.